Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on February 4th, 2026, features Gordon Masterton presenting Sir Sandford Fleming, Nation Builder.
Hello and welcome. I'm Chuck Spinks. I'm past chair of the American Society of Civil Engineers History and Heritage Committee, and calling in today from California, where the high will be 67 degrees Fahrenheit today, about 19 degrees centigrade. I'll be your host for today's tripartite New Transatlantic Cable Civil Engineering History webinar. The intent of the tripartite webinar series, we call the Transatlantic Cable, is to enhance interaction between the societies and their members and recognize that civil engineering history crosses international boundaries. The talks are to be on topics that involve at least two of the three participating societies. So here's Gordon Masterson, our speaker today. Gordon is a past president of ICE. He's chair of the Panel for Historical Engineering Works and founder of the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, to which Fleming was also inducted in 2025. He has contributed to TV series such as Life After People, Canals, The Making of Modern Britain, Britain's Greatest Bridges, and a recent episode of BBC's Radio 4's Great Lives on Lady Rachel McRobert. Gordon is the recipient of the 2025 ASCE Civil Engineering History and Heritage Award. Gordon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I'll be talking about the life and times of possibly the most energetic, intrepid, influential, and impactful civil engineer that I've come across, Sandford Fleming, with links actually to all three of our countries that participate in the webinar. And I hope I can convince you by the end of the talk of his unique qualities. Here's the first written reference to Sandford Fleming, the record of his birth in Kirkcaldy, Scotland on 7th of January 1827. His parents were Andrew Gregg Fleming, a cabinet maker, and Elizabeth Arnott. They'd been married nearby in Kennyway, Fife on the 23rd of March 1822. They had 8 children in total between 1823 and 1839. Sandford was the third of them after elder brother David and elder sister Anne. And the name is not a common one in Scotland, but it's named after his maternal grandfather, Sandford Arnott. Slightly misheard in the scribe of the old parish register here and entered as Sandford without the middle D. That confusion did actually become a frequent occurrence, and several documents and pamphlets published have got his name as Sandford without the middle D. So be mindful of that when you're researching and looking for material on Sandford Fleming. Now, Kirkcaldy was a town in Fife in Scotland and stretched along part of the shoreline of the Firth of Forth, known mainly then for its harbour, some boat building, leatherworks, brickworks, glassworks, and early linen factories. Its population was about to increase rapidly, but in Fleming's time, it was still a small town, even by Scottish standards of the time. And homing in on that map of Kirkcaldy at the time, to the southern section, you can see why it was called the Lang Toon. That's Long Town in translation. The Flemings lived in Glassworks Wynd. I've surrounded it in red and bottom right there. And the family don't appear on this map, which has all the householders. So Andrew Fleming was not a house owner at that time. And the lane led straight down to what was then a sandy beach. It's not like Kirkcaldy nowadays. You can imagine the young Fleming family gazing out to sea, watching the sailing ships, and thinking thoughts of what's beyond the Firth of Forth and sensing adventure when they were young. Now, top left there on the screen, I've got another red square, and that is Mr. Sang's nurseries. And Mr. Sang, S-A-N-G, was Edward Sang, at the time Provost of Kirkcaldy. Now, after his schooling, Sandford became very close to the Sang family, and he was apprenticed at the age of 14 to John Sang, civil engineer. Not a national figure of repute, but certainly of regional significance in Fife. These railways that are mentioned in his obituary, halfway down, I won't read it all, were the first that Sandford worked on as a junior draftsman and field surveyor. But there's a clue in John Sang's brief obituary that he was more than a typical civil engineer, and the yellow highlighted section gave me reason to do a little bit more digging into the Sang family. And Father Edward, the Provost of Kirkcaldy one time, was a nurseryman by trade, as we saw on the map, but he'd taken a scientific approach to his trade and actually published experimental results. That must have been pretty unusual for a nurseryman. But his older brother, Sandford's older brother, Edward, was the most distinguished of them all, really, with multiple publications, mainly mathematical, and worked for Edinburgh University, Manchester New College, and for 12 years, he was in Constantinople introducing civil engineering education to the Turkish nation at the Imperial School before returning to Edinburgh. John Sang himself, Edward's younger brother, patented a planimeter for measuring areas from any outline. So we have something really of a Renaissance family for the young Sandford to look up to. Perhaps he was encouraged by them to seek his fortunes in North America. But this diary entry of Sandford's at the time that he was 18 years old suggests that they certainly didn't discourage his ambitions. And John Sang presented him with a pocket sextant to direct his travels in North America. On 22nd of April, 1845, then, Sandford and his older brother, David, sailed from Glasgow on the Aberdeen-built three-master brig, Brilliant, of about 330 tons or so. And they had to pay £13.10 for the passage, bread and potatoes provided, but passengers to bring their own bedding. And it's interesting, Fleming kept this ticket. It was such a life-changing step. Experiencing gales and icebergs on the way, they reached Quebec 6 weeks later on 6th of June 1845. Then they took a steamboat called the Queen to Montreal, then a river steamer on the Ottawa River to Bytown, now Ottawa. Then the Rideau Canal to Kingston, Lake Ontario, then to Cobourg, where they disembarked and travelled by road to Peterborough to stay with Dr. Hutchison, who was a family connection. And they stayed with the Hutchisons till early August or so. And having a family connection in the New World was really a very common start for new immigrants and a strong influence, I would imagine, on them deciding to take that step in the first place. So after a few weeks there in Peterborough, the boys moved on by road again and steamer to find work in Toronto. And David found work pretty quickly, but Sandford didn't. He applied to the Department of Roads and Harbours, was told by Casimir, later Sir Casimir Zowski, that the great works are nearly all finished and men are being paid off, not taken on, and he advised Fleming to return to Scotland. Now, Fleming tried to find work in Hamilton, Ontario, before going back to Peterborough and accepting a temporary post as draftsman to Richard Birdsall until about February 1846. He mapped the town, did the lithography himself, and marketed town maps, adding Newcastle and Coburg as well as a source of additional income, just to keep him going. And he realized to get professional work, he needed a Canadian qualification. And he articled himself to Stout and Dennis of Weston to be a certified land surveyor. To do so, he had to journey back to Montreal to sit and pass an exam and receive his commission from Lord Elgin, the governor, the day of the riots after the Rebellion Losses Bill on the 25th of April, 1849. So Sandford Fleming has a habit of being there on the days of impactful events. And this was what happened that day. The riots led to a fire of Montreal Parliamentary Building. When it first started, he actually went into the building with a few others to try to rescue some old books and rare books that he'd already seen there, having visited it before he took his exam. But the library was already in flames. So instead, he spotted inside the building the portrait of the young Queen Victoria and prized it off the wall with 3 other men helping, cut it from the frame, and they carried it out on their shoulders. And it's now hung in the Senate building in Ottawa. And bizarrely, turned out to be a survivor of 3 more fires in the buildings she was hanging in, the equivalent of a Jonah for fire starting. I borrowed this particular image from a post on Commissioners Canada Facebook page, so I'm hoping they don't mind a bit more publicity without advance permission. 2 months later, back in Toronto, Fleming was the protagonist in the formation of the Canadian Institute, now the Royal Canadian Institute for Science. On 20th of June, 1849, Fleming, with a few other land surveyors, civil engineers, and architects, met in the offices of Kivas Tully, who was an Irish-Canadian architect, near the corner of King and Yonge Streets in Toronto, and decided to form a Canadian Institute. In 1851, it was granted a Royal Charter as a society for the encouragement and general advancement of the physical sciences, the arts, and the manufactures in this part of our dominions. After a slow start to the Institute, Fleming revitalized it and organized a program of meetings in the Mechanics Institute every Saturday night at 7 p.m. It's nice that RCI Science features Fleming in its history and illustrates him, but they show him as an old man in this on the website. And he founded the Canadian Institute when he was 22 years old. So my appeal to the RCI Science is to find a younger picture of Fleming to reflect that. The first Canadian journal was printed in 1852, and on page 3 can be seen Sandford Fleming as secretary. Now, anyone who's been involved in institutional committees knows that the person who does most of the work is the secretary. And of course, that had to be Sandford Fleming, making it happen. And note also on this page the names of Frederick Cumberland, corresponding secretary, and Alfred Brunel. We'll see them again shortly. Around this time, Fleming was also responsible for Canada's first postage stamp. The British Crown transferred authority for a postal system to the province of Canada in early 1851. And Postmaster General James Morris approached Sandford Fleming in Toronto, met up with him on the 24th of February, 1851. And in that meeting, Fleming suggested the idea of using the beaver to illustrate the first Canadian postage stamp, representing industriousness, building skills, and tenacity. It might have been a spark of genius in that meeting that he thought of this, but he certainly received the design commission, and the first stamps were issued on the 23rd of April, 1851. And that whole process of the province being granted the permission to publish its own postage stamps and for the first stamp to appear is remarkably quick, as was most things in the life of Sandford Fleming. And of course, the beaver was to become Canada's official emblematic animal in 1975. And as we've heard, Fleming couldn't live in a town without mapping it, and Toronto was no exception. Here is his plan, also published in 1851, from his survey with his drawings of key buildings. And he had a good grasp of the value of intellectual property rights, and there was a point where his name was not planned to appear on the plan, and he threatened to pull out altogether if that happened. He's still only 24 at that time, and he well knew that every opportunity to make his name known would help his career prospects. So this was part of the Fleming realization that networking was important. His break into railways was in 1852, when he and Alfred Brunel, one of his colleagues from the Canadian Institute, were appointed assistant engineers to Frederick Cumberland, also from the Canadian Institute, for the Ontario, Simcoe and Huron Railway. So another illustration of Fleming being a consummate networker, and it turns out his zeal in forming the Canadian Institute had provided a side benefit to the next step in his career. Fleming had been present at the sod turning of the beginnings of that railway in Toronto the year before by Lady Elgin. That was October 1851. And Fleming had kept and preserved the sod that was turned over. And when he completed his work with the railway and retired from it in January 1863, 12 years later, by which time it was the Northern Railway, he presented a piece of that original sod, presumably a bit dried out by then, to the company. It's not recorded, as far as I'm aware, what they actually did with it. And somewhat matter-of-factly, the biography of Fleming by Lawrence Burpee states, the first section from Toronto to Aurora, 30 miles, was open to the public on May 16, 1853. Remember, Fleming began work with Cumberland and Brunel in 1852, and the sod was turned 6 months before that. So the next section to Bradford on June 13th of the same year, and the line was completed to Barrie on October 11th, and before the end of the following year to Collingwood on Georgian Bay. That's 100 miles of railway built in, at that time, remote country in 3 years. Not enough time for there to be an EIA nowadays. Not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a thing. Now, the company was to be responsible for commissioning the first Canadian-built locomotives. Their first, however, the very first, was actually built in Portland, Maine, and named the Lady Elgin. The Elgin family has their family seat in Broome Hall, also in Fife, birthplace of Fleming, a bit further along the coast from where Fleming was born. But there's no denying that the Scottish network in Canada was pretty strong at that time. Now, because of the high customs duties and shipping costs of Lady Elgin, the locomotive that is, the railroad executives decided that subsequent locomotives would be built in Ontario. And this is Toronto engine number 2 for the railway and the first of 9 to be built by the James Good foundry in Toronto. Photographs suggest it was the identical specification to the first train. And before Fleming resigned from the Northern Railway, he'd written and submitted a detailed 44-page report to the Canadian government advocating an ocean-to-ocean transcontinental railroad of some 2,600 miles. Note 2, the inclusion of road and telegraph communications in the same report. He recognized already that Canada would need the full gamut of modern communication systems along the corridor that he was recommending between the Atlantic and Pacific. Now, after an interlude as an advocate for better connections to the Red River colony in Canada, which included a trip to London to meet the British Foreign Secretary, the Duke of Newcastle at the time. Then he returned to New York, as it happens, on Brunel's Great Eastern, biggest ship in the world at the time. And soon after that, the Premier, Sir John A. Macdonald, summoned him from Toronto up to Quebec and asked him to be the Upper Canada and Quebec government nominee of 3 surveyors intended to be appointed to plan a railway from Quebec to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. When those 2 provinces heard that Fleming was nominated, they asked him for him also to be their nominee. And finally, when that news reached London, the Duke of Newcastle also endorsed Fleming, and therefore he was appointed with sole authority from all 3 nominating bodies. Fleming's visit clearly to London on the Red River colony business had fortuitously again for him paid off, and in that he knew and had personally met the Duke of Newcastle. So by the age of 36, he had commanded the respect of the British government, the governments in Upper Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia for the largest infrastructure project to date in British North America. But as it happens, that respect didn't necessarily transfer later to the 4 commissioners selected to oversee the railway construction. Fleming had directed all the bridges to be iron in his specifications. The commissioners wanted wood, cheaper. Fleming wanted the contracts to be based on schedule and price with remeasurement, acknowledging the many uncertainties yet to be resolved with an incomplete design. The commissioners wanted lump sum contracts. In Fleming's words, the knowledge of the work required on any section was insufficient yet to admit of letting the work for a bulk sum, that no contractor could exactly understand the extent of the obligation which he was assuming, and that contracts let on this system, as matters then were, would certainly end unsatisfactorily, and that difficulties would arise to perplex the engineers, the commissioners, and finally the government. He also pointed out that all contracts should only be let on known data, but that if it were deemed advisable to commence construction before the measurements were completed and the exact quantities established, the principle of measurement and schedule price should be adopted. A contractor would then perfectly understand that he would only be paid at the prices in his tender for all the work which he performed, and for that only. Now, I'm on Fleming's side here, but the commissioners apparently knew better, because they did let the first contracts as lump sums. But before the expiration of 12 months, 5 out of the 7 contracts had to be annulled and relet at a large advance. And lessons like these are still being learned today, unfortunately, in some sectors. So how did the Battle of the Bridges play out? I mentioned Fleming's advocacy of iron and the commissioners for wood. Well, Fleming's side of the story is that the principles of construction which he'd advocated were the right ones, but no argument which he could advance appeared to have the least weight with the commissioners. They had determined that the recommendations of the chief engineer should simply be set aside, and that iron shouldn't be used, timber should take its place. Now, Fleming put the case actually before the Premier. He went above the heads of the commissioners. And he put the case to Sir John Macdonald in 1869, and the commissioners had to submit their side. And the net result was that the commissioners were sustained. The government supported their appointees. 5 bridges, however, as a concession, were exempted from the timber principle. The following year, 1870, the chief engineer returned to the attack with typical Scottish pertinacity. He submitted for Parliament the arguments in favour of iron bridges, the cost, and the ultimate economy. One commissioner actually came over to the chief engineer's side, but 3 held their ground. Privy Council backed the 3 commissioners. In July, Fleming wrote a further letter to the Premier, and in August to the commissioners. One of them, Mr. Bridges, replied in a communication to the Privy Council, disputing the figures of the chief engineer, and probably entirely fed up by now, arguing that the fear of wooden bridges catching fire was groundless. Fleming rejoined by proving conclusively the accuracy of his figures, and by citing 2 distinct cases of wooden bridges on the Grand Trunk Railway under the management of Mr. Bridges, the commissioner, having been destroyed by fire within a few weeks of the date of his letter. And the commissioners finally surrendered, agreeing that all bridges over 60 feet span should be of iron. This didn't end the matter. Fleming was still not satisfied. He persisted in his efforts to have every bridge on the intercolonial, down to the smallest span of 24 feet made of iron. And at last an order in council was passed in May 1871 to have them so constructed. Ultimately, with the exception of 3 structures built of wood by direction of the commissioners against the protest of the chief engineer, still, all the bridge spans of whatever width throughout the line were iron bridges. In many ways, this is my favourite Fleming story. He just wouldn't give in and persisted until he got his way, because he strongly felt that it was the right thing to do. He won't have made friends with the commissioners by not being pliant and submissive. And we can see that anyone who disagreed with his strongly felt beliefs would almost inevitably lose a war of attrition. But when important matters are at stake, who better to be arguing your case than a principled Scottish terrier nipping at your heels if he didn't get his own way? His role in the intercolonial railway was noticed far afield, and in 1871 he was elected as a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. In London, he was nominated by William Fairbairn, by then in his 80s and a baronet, and supported by what is in effect civil engineering royalty, including several future presidents. And here is the actual citation preserved in the archives of the institution, with the transcript here of the projects to date that were completed and cited in support. Principally the Intercolonial Railway, at that time still under construction, nearly 500 miles in length. And of course, he was elected. How could he not be? And the Intercolonial project was another signal to authorities in Britain and Canada that it was feasible to form a confederation. And by 1867, it was to become a railway of the new Dominion of Canada. And Fleming must have been thinking ahead to what he hoped might be his next great project, completing his vision of railways unifying the nation. And in 1871, he got his wish and was appointed engineer-in-chief of the Canadian Pacific Railway. But reportedly, the government still had to apply pressure on Fleming, at least he says so, to accept in the national interest, because he still had responsibilities to complete the intercolonial, which would actually take another 5 years of his employment. But privately, I'm sure he was always going to accept the invitation to be the chief engineer for the Canadian Pacific. It was what he'd been dreaming of for at least 10 years, as we've seen from that pamphlet. A rail link across Canada, ocean to ocean, now starting from his own railway, the intercolonial, opening up then later fertile areas to the west and providing a unification with British Columbia that was real rather than just on paper. And this would be his way of consolidating the nation through engineering, and I'm sure he relished the prospect of that. Immediately, he put together 13 parties of around 40 surveyors to investigate east-west routes, and in April 1872, he selected a preferred route that crossed the Rockies through the Yellowhead Pass. Now, leaving Toronto in July 1872, he led a party to travel the route, roughly, which became immortalized by the Reverend George Grant in his account, Ocean to Ocean. And Grant was chosen by Fleming as his secretary to what they called the Overlanders Party. Grant had been born in Nova Scotia, studied theology in Glasgow University, and returned to Nova Scotia to be minister eventually in St. Matthew's Church, Halifax, from 1863 to 1877. And Halifax was where Sandford Fleming lived during the years of the Intercolonial Railway, and he would have met Sandford Fleming. Grant and Fleming would have met there. He was also chosen because it was known that Grant was a strong supporter and advocate of the consolidation of the Dominion. And the first edition of the book that Grant wrote of the account of the journey, Ocean to Ocean, was published simultaneously in Toronto and London, suggesting that this was as much a shrewd piece of public relations by Fleming to secure support for the great project of a 2,500 mile long railway. And it worked. It caught the mood of the young Dominion and was a bestseller. The first contracts for the construction of the railway were actually let in 1875, just 3 years after the survey of the route. And in the 1870s, the significant challenges of building a route even north of Lake Superior were overcome around that time. And it had to survive as a project the political upheavals of the Pacific scandal when MacDonald had to resign as Prime Minister in late 1873, linked to some large donations received from those apparently lobbying to win contracts. In 1877, Fleming was granted leave to visit London and attract finance and contractors there. And eventually, in 1878, tenders were issued to build and operate the CPR from Ontario to the Pacific. But in 1888, the first of the contracts let, change of government again in 1880. The government changed. The Conservative government under MacDonald came back in again and replaced the Liberals. That had happened in 1878. But soon after that, some of Fleming's engineering decisions had been criticised in Parliament, and he felt the need to reply. And this is the pamphlet that was the reply to the criticism that had been made in the House of Commons of the time. And it is a pretty convincing reply, by the way. Fleming was usually more right than wrong in the matters that I've been reading through. But also in 1880, the Canadian Pacific Railway changed from an entirely national endeavour where the government had to raise the funds to effectively a privately operated railway under George Stephen and his cousin Donald Smith, who later became Lord Strathcona. And Fleming was replaced as chief engineer at that time by his probably a lot more compliant assistant, Collingwood Schreiber. But Fleming was compensated with $30,000 and retained as a consultant to the railway. He was just too well known and too well respected to be summarily dismissed, but he was no longer engineer-in-chief from that point on. And the new regime changed the route west of the Red River area and crossed the Rockies further south than Fleming's preferred Yellowhead Pass in favour of the more topographically challenging Kicking Horse Pass. And that had 4.5% gradients. It was known as the Big Hill. And 25 years later, really to resolve that and to make the crossing manageable and effective and economic, 25 years later, 2 spirals had to be introduced in tunnels to de-risk that route. But Fleming couldn't keep away, or perhaps he couldn't be kept away. And in 1884, he was appointed a director of the CPR and was present when the last spike was driven by Donald A. Smith, later Lord Strathcona, in 1885. And here's this iconic photograph. Well, one of them, their series were taken, another one where Lord Strathcona's hitting the spike itself. Donald Smith's holding the hammer. Fleming is immediately behind him, looking on from behind, with the tallest of the top hats. And it looks to me like he's kind of hoping that Smith might miss the spike when he yields the hammer. But here's the extent of the huge endeavour that was the Canadian Pacific Railway, difficult to get onto one slide. 2,500 miles of railroad constructed in only 10 years for the new lines. That's progress that modern railways can only dream of. Now, if Fleming had only planned and built great railways, that would have been enough for his place in engineering history. But his ideas and advocacy for a British state-owned telegraph cable across the Pacific, completing telegraphic connections from Britain to Australia westwards, was another of his compelling missions in life. And from 1879, when he'd first floated the concept, to 1902, when the cable was ultimately laid from Vancouver Island to New Zealand and Australia, he kept the matter alive, not only in Canada, but in England and Australasia. And I found that his role in this particular advocacy and endeavour is studied in great detail in a 1972 PhD history thesis by David A. Richardson, who has delved into the Sandford Fleming archives and has a very compelling account of his role in making that happen. He had to overcome apathy in Canada initially, inactivity and prevarication of the British government and its civil service, and particularly the powerful opposition of the Eastern Telegraph Company, which of course held the monopoly of the overland cables between Britain and Australia at that time through countries like Turkey and Persia. But through political manoeuvring and public advocacy, Fleming ultimately succeeded, though he wished his plan was to go even further with this all-red line of telegraphic cables, which he saw as a great imperial intelligence union. He was a great advocate of the empire. And that was in a 1906 pamphlet, linking the British Empire around the world, entirely in British-owned territories. But the British Empire wasn't to last long enough to allow it to happen, of course. But actually, it would have been strategically incredibly valuable if it had been completed before World War I. His handling and domination of the Jubilee Colonial Conference of 1877 in London was a masterpiece of Machiavellian influence. And Fleming's efforts to personally claim the barren Necker Island, south of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific, as a landfall for the first length of cable, almost deserves to be made into a movie. It's almost too incredible to be true, but it was. He was planning to plant the flag on Necker Island. It ended up being annexed by Hawaii instead, but a more expensive option, Fanning Island in the middle of the Pacific, was annexed by Great Britain in March 1888, and that became an intermediate landfall for the cable to New Zealand. That's still not quite all. Fleming was also the instigator, designer, and promoter of the adoption of standardized time. In 1879, Fleming's report on time reckoning and a prime meridian, read initially before the Canadian Institute, Fleming's Canadian Institute, was sent to Governor-General Lord Lorne Campbell, who forwarded it to the Colonial Office with his full support. For Fleming, the chief vehicle to make it happen became the American Society of Civil Engineers, which was dominated by railwaymen, and railways would be the greatest beneficiaries of a standard, universally understood time system for the convenience of passengers. The ASCE made him chairman of its Standing Committee on Time in 1881 and basically just turned him loose. He carried out a survey of railwaymen and scientists about his proposals, using the offices of the society, paying the costs himself. And he planned to use the data to petition Congress to convene a conference. But actually, the railway managers decided to act at once, since his data had demonstrated a clear consensus. And on 18th of November 1883, the railways of North America adopted the system of 1-hour time zones. Because of its simplicity, railway time soon became the standard for the continent. But the need still remained for global uniformity. The key players of the Meteorological Society and the ASCE were successful in getting US Congress to call an international gathering in 1884 to decide on the core question, where the prime meridian would be. Fleming was the only delegate to go into print and distribute a position paper. No surprise there. The conference eventually endorsed his main points, but each country was to make its own decision on adoption. And it ended up, of course, a mean time based on an existing prime meridian through Greenwich, London, with hourly variations according to established time zones, became the standard before the end of the century in most major countries. In 1880, Fleming was appointed Chancellor of Queen's College in Kingston, Ontario, later to be Queen's University. The principal for most of his 35-year term as Chancellor was his overlander friend and author of Ocean to Ocean, the Reverend George Grant. Many of his addresses to graduation ceremonies are published. Read them all, I reckon each of them would have taken the best part of an hour to deliver. So, aside from being a bit long-winded in his speeches to students, is it possible to discern the triggers for Fleming's prodigious achievements in many fields in his lifetime? My starters for 10 are listed here. He had a practical engineering education from a solid educational base in Scotland, which instilled an inquiring and an analytical mindset. He had energy in abundance and was a persistent so-and-so till he got his own way. And he had firmly held beliefs of his purpose in life. In his case, many purposes in life. And he directed his talents and persistence to those purposes with considerable vigor. And that translated into something we need much more of today, perhaps, engineers not being reticent to speak truth to power. He usually got his own way, not always. So, as a fellow Scot and indeed a fellow Fifer in Scotland and a civil engineer, I doff my hat to Sir Sandford Fleming, the young and the old Fleming. Surveyor, cartographer, civil engineer, postage stamp designer, founder of a learned society, chief engineer for over 3,000 miles of railways, promoter of the Pacific Telegraph cable, deviser and promoter of international time zones, university chancellor, husband and father of 6 children, inducted into the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame in 2025. I can't help thinking, though, if only he'd stayed at home, what might he have done for Kirkcaldy? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. We have time for some. You stated that Fleming was more often right than wrong. Was he easy to get along with?
It depends whether you shared his beliefs or not. If you did, I'm sure he was very easy to get along with. If not, I think he would have been a bit of a nightmare and just kept persisting and doggedly objecting to the course. The story of the Battle of the Bridges on the Intercolonial is just incredible, really, that he didn't just try once. He kept going back, ended up 4 times making submissions and representations to get his own way, for very good reason, as we would probably now judge from our standpoint. So I think he would have made many friends, but in equal measure, many enemies, which is probably why he wasn't seen as being flexible enough and pliant enough to continue as chief engineer for the Canadian Pacific Railway. The knives were out for him. Before Fleming was admitted to the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, were his achievements recognised anywhere in Scotland, he deserves to be better known. And Sue's ashamed that she'd never heard of him prior to the talk. Yes, he does have a plaque in Kirkcaldy, of course, his birthplace, and that's a decent recognition. But I've asked other Canadians, my good neighbour in Edinburgh, Professor Luke Bisbee, and he said, "You shouldn't have asked me, Gordon, because I'm the exception. I pored over that picture of the driving of the last spike. I know Fleming very, very well. Most Canadians, probably not, and certainly British folks, even less so."
We've got a ton of very positive people saying great presentation and history. Thank you for your efforts. Are there drawings, examples of his designs? Are there bridges of his design still in service?
That's a very good question. I did try to establish just how closely Fleming was involved with the actual bridges on the Intercolonial, but I didn't get to a conclusion to satisfy myself on that. I have a feeling that he would have been the engineer-in-chief, and the members of the team would be the main protagonists for the design of the bridges and the structures. I don't think Fleming had the full gamut of engineering education to be designing iron bridges. I could be wrong. I'd be happy to prove wrong, but my feeling is it was others in the team.
Thank you. I'll identify Jacob Lamb because he says, as another fellow civil engineer from Fife, I also tip my hat to Sir Fleming. My question is, did any of his children follow his footsteps and become an engineer? If not, do you know what they did?
Well, I don't know actually, because I had enough work on my hands just figuring out everything that he'd achieved in his lifetime, which was prodigious. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out, actually. There's a nice project, Jacob, if you could pick that up and let us know.
How did he design the 300 bridges across the country with no rainfall flow statistics available from Thunder Bay to Vancouver?
Oh, the answer to that is probably, maybe not always adequately. We would spend years planning and researching and surveying and understanding the landscape and the environment, including the flood susceptibility, scour susceptibility. They didn't have time for that in 1870 to build the Canadian Pacific Railway in 10 years from Toronto-ish, Fort William certainly, to Vancouver. They had to make engineering judgments.
Yeah.
And probably some of them came a cropper sooner than they maybe would have.
So there's a footnote there. The CSCE celebrated the Winnipeg's Louise Bridges as a National Historic Site last summer. And that was the first crossing of the CPR across the Red River. And the original plan, Fleming's plan, had been to put it quite farther north. The citizens of Winnipeg actually paid for a bridge at Winnipeg to cross there. But there's a lot of correspondence that talks about how Fleming knew that Winnipeg had flooded frequently in the past, and he really didn't want to have anything to do with it. But
Yes.
he was overruled anyway. Everybody's just crowing about the great presentation. Chuck, did you want to wind things up, please?
Okay, thank you. That ends our program. We look forward to seeing you in March. Have a pleasant couple of months in the meantime.
Thanks very much, Chuck.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.